No, not again. Oh, come on. Why me? I cannot believe this. It's ruined. Look at it. This is the worst luck ever. Completely ruined.
There are lives structured so thoroughly around routine that even minor deviations create disproportionate stress, where the predictability of daily patterns provides psychological scaffolding that maintains functioning when internal resources feel depleted, where the sameness of morning coffee and commute timing and workplace arrival serves not as limitation but as necessary structure, preventing collapse into the chaos that threatens just beneath the surface of maintained competence. Jacob Miller had been living such a life for approximately 8 months, since the period of accumulated professional pressure and personal difficulty had degraded his capacity for spontaneity and had made rigid routine feel like the only reliable way to manage the demands of each day without being overwhelmed by them. The morning of November 14th began like every weekday morning for the past 8 months had begun, alarm at 6:15 a.m., 20 minutes of lying in bed attempting to generate motivation to actually get up, shower and dressing in clothes selected the night before to eliminate morning decision-making, departure from his apartment at 7:35 a.m., 3-block walk to Greystone Cafe where he'd arrive at approximately 7:42 a.m., order of medium dark roast coffee and everything bagel with cream cheese. Consumption of breakfast while reviewing work materials for 30 minutes, departure from cafe at 8:15 a.m., 6-minute walk to subway station, arrival at platform at 8:21 a.m., boarding of 8:24 a.m. train that would deliver him to his office building station at 8:47 a.m., arrival at his desk by 9 a.m. This routine was precise not because Jacob was naturally organized or particularly valued efficiency, but because precision had become necessary coping mechanism, had become way of reducing the number of decisions and uncertainties that each day presented, had become method of conserving limited psychological resources for the work demands that consumed most of his energy and attention. He was 34 years old, worked as senior project manager at mid-sized architecture firm, had been with the company for 6 years and had been promoted to senior role 18 months earlier, shortly before the combination of increased responsibilities and personal relationship ending had created the sustained period of high-functioning exhaustion that had made routine feel essential rather than optional. The relationship ending had been mutual, neither dramatic breakup nor bitter conflict, just gradual recognition that he and Amanda had been together more from inertia than from genuine compatibility, that their 3-year relationship had been comfortable without being particularly fulfilling, that ending it was more honest than continuing to perform commitment neither of them actually felt. The ending had been in April, had been initiated through calm conversation over dinner where both had acknowledged what they'd probably known for months, had been executed with appropriate adult maturity through division of shared possessions and coordination about lease that Amanda would keep while Jacob found new apartment. The ending should have been relief, was relief in some ways, eliminated the low-grade dishonesty of maintaining relationship that wasn't working, created space for both of them to potentially find more genuine connections. But it had also eliminated the structure that shared life had provided, had left Jacob living alone in new apartment in neighborhood he didn't know well, had removed the person who'd been his primary social connection and had left him without clear framework for how to rebuild social life at 34 when most of his friendships had been couple friendships that had dissolved when the couple dissolved. The work promotion had come just 2 months after the relationship ending, had been opportunity Jacob had been working toward for years but that had arrived at precisely wrong moment when he was already dealing with personal disruption and when additional professional pressure was last thing he needed. The senior project manager role meant managing multiple projects simultaneously, meant coordinating between architects and clients and contractors, meant being responsible for budgets and timelines and stakeholder relationships, meant working 60-hour weeks regularly and occasionally working weekend hours when project deadlines demanded it. Jacob had accepted the promotion because refusing seemed like admitting he couldn't handle it, because the salary increase was significant enough to help with the additional housing costs of living alone, because he'd spent years positioning himself for exactly this advancement and walking away from it would have felt like professional suicide. But accepting meant absorbing substantial additional stress during period when his personal resources for managing stress were already depleted, meant maintaining high-level professional performance while simultaneously navigating loneliness and uncertainty about personal life, meant presenting confidence and competence at work while feeling increasingly fragile and overwhelmed internally. The routine had emerged as response to this combination of circumstances. had started as just maintaining consistent morning schedule to ensure reliable arrival at work, had gradually expanded to encompass increasing portions of his day, had become more rigid as months passed and as the psychological benefits of predictability became more apparent. The same cafe, the same order, the same arrival time at the subway platform, these patterns eliminated uncertainty, created islands of control in life that otherwise felt increasingly uncontrollable, provided small reliable pleasures during period when genuine joy felt largely absent. But the routine also created fragility, meant that any disruption to the established pattern created stress disproportionate to the disruption's actual significance, meant that running late or encountering unexpected obstacles triggered anxiety that was really about the broader sense of things falling apart rather than about the immediate inconvenience. Jacob understood this intellectually, understood that his rigid adherence to routine was compensatory behavior rather than optimal way to live, but understanding didn't change the fact that the routine was what was currently keeping him functional, was what allowed him to continue meeting his professional obligations while managing the personal difficulties he was navigating. On the morning of November 14th, Jacob arrived at Greystone Cafe at 7:43 a.m., 1 minute later than typical, which already created slight anxiety that he tried to suppress as irrational. The cafe was busier than usual, several people ahead of him in line, which meant additional delay. He joined the queue, tried to maintain the patient composure he'd been cultivating as part of managing his stress levels, checked his phone to verify he still had adequate time to maintain his schedule if service was reasonably efficient. The barista who took his order was someone Jacob didn't recognize, not Carmen, who usually worked the morning shift and who knew his order without him having to speak it, but younger man whose name tag identified him as Tyler, who appeared to be training based on how carefully he was inputting orders into the register system and how frequently he was checking with more experienced barista about procedures. This unfamiliarity created additional friction. Jacob had to actually state his order rather than just offering confirming nod. Tyler had to ask clarifying questions about size and preparation that Carmen never needed to ask. The interaction took longer than the practiced efficiency Jacob was accustomed to. Small frustrations, individually trivial, but accumulating into sense that the morning was already deviating from established pattern in ways that created background stress. Jacob paid, moved to the pickup area, waited while his order was prepared. The cafe was more crowded than usual, maybe 15 people occupying the small space's various tables and counter seats, creating noise level and visual activity that felt more chaotic than the typical morning atmosphere. Jacob tried to ignore his rising irritation, reminded himself that these were normal variations in cafe operations, that his reaction was disproportionate to the actual situation. His order arrived, coffee in standard paper cup, bagel in paper bag. Jacob took both, moved toward his usual table near the window, the small two-person table that was typically available at this hour and that provided adequate space to spread out his work materials while eating breakfast. But this morning the table was occupied, young woman with laptop and scattered papers, clearly settled in for extended work session, clearly not planning to vacate the space Jacob had come to think of as his usual spot. More irritation. Jacob stood holding his coffee and bagel, scanning for alternative seating, finding only cramped counter space along the wall that would require eating standing up and that wouldn't accommodate spreading out his presentation materials. He moved to that counter space, set his coffee down carefully on the narrow surface, retrieved his bagel from its bag, began eating while standing awkwardly in position that allowed other customers to pass behind him without collision. The presentation materials he needed to review were in folder in his messenger bag. He pulled out the folder, approximately 40 pages of architectural drawings and project specifications and timeline documents that he'd been planning to review one final time before the morning's client meeting, materials he'd organized carefully the previous evening and that he needed to be thoroughly familiar with to conduct the meeting effectively. He set the folder on the counter beside his coffee cup, opened it to the first page, began reading while taking bites of his bagel. The counter was narrow, maybe 10 inches deep, designed for brief coffee pickup rather than for extended occupation. Jacob's coffee cup sat near the counter's back edge, his folder was open in front of it, his body was positioned at slight angle to allow room for people passing behind him. The arrangement was awkward, was requiring more attention to maintaining balance and position than his usual table seating would have required, was creating additional small stress that was making the morning feel increasingly wrong even though nothing actually dramatic had occurred. At 8:41 a.m., A man passing behind Jacob bumped his elbow, not aggressively, not even particularly noticeably from the man's perspective, just ordinary navigation through crowded cafe space that resulted in brief contact. But the contact was enough to disrupt Jacob's careful positioning, was enough to shift his arms slightly forward, was enough to knock against his coffee cup in ways that destabilized it on the narrow counter surface. The cup tipped. Fell. Hot coffee splashed across the counter, across Jacob's open presentation folder, across his shirt and pants. The liquid was genuinely hot, not hot enough to burn but hot enough to create immediate physical discomfort, hot enough to make Jacob gasp and step backward, hot enough to soak through his clothing and create the unpleasant sensation of wet fabric against skin. The presentation materials were instantly ruined, paper absorbing coffee, architectural drawings becoming stained and wrinkled, timeline documents becoming illegible as ink ran together with liquid. The cafe's ambient noise diminished as people nearby turned to look at the spill, creating that particular moment of public attention that accompanies minor disasters in shared spaces. Several people offered sympathetic noises or asked if he was okay. Tyler the barista rushed over with stack of paper towels, began helping clean the counter while apologizing profusely even though the spill wasn't his fault. Jacob stood there dripping coffee, feeling hot liquid soaking through his clothing, staring at his ruined presentation materials, experiencing surge of frustration and anger that felt disproportionate to the situation but that was nonetheless overwhelming. "I'm so sorry," Tyler was saying, handing Jacob paper towels to address the coffee soaking his clothing. "Let me get you a replacement coffee, no charge. And if you need help cleaning those papers." "They're ruined," Jacob said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I have a client presentation in less than an hour and these materials are completely ruined." "I'm really sorry," Tyler repeated, looking genuinely distressed by the situation even though he bore no responsibility for it. "I can definitely get you a replacement coffee. And maybe we can try to salvage some of the papers." "I don't know, I'm sorry, Jacob took a breath, tried to moderate his response, recognized that his anger was directed at the situation rather than at Tyler specifically but that Tyler was receiving it anyway. "It's fine. It's not your fault. I need to clean this up." The cleanup process took approximately 10 minutes. Mopping coffee from the counter and floor, attempting to separate the soaked pages of his presentation materials to see if any could be salvaged, most couldn't. The liquid had penetrated thoroughly, had rendered the documents unusable. Accepting the replacement coffee Tyler offered along with several more apologies, dabbing at his coffee-stained clothing with paper towels in futile attempt to make the staining less obvious. By the time Jacob had addressed the immediate mess, it was 8:51 a.m. His normal departure time from the cafe had been 8:15 a.m. He was now 36 minutes behind his established routine, was experiencing the particular anxiety that came from having his carefully maintained schedule disrupted, was calculating whether he could still make his usual 8:24 a.m. train. No, that was impossible now, and what his options were for reaching the office on time for his 9:30 a.m. client meeting, probably taking a taxi rather than subway. Which would be expensive but which would ensure reliable arrival time. He checked his phone's transit app to see the next subway departure time. The screen loaded, showed his usual route, displayed message in red text, service temporarily suspended due to incident. Expect significant delays. Jacob stared at the message without immediately processing its implications. Service suspended. His frustration about the spilled coffee and ruined materials and delayed departure was so consuming that the subway suspension registered initially as just another problem in accumulating series of problems, just another disruption to his carefully planned morning that was spiraling further from the routine he'd been maintaining. He switched to checking taxi availability on his phone's rideshare app, saw that estimated pickup time was 12 minutes with estimated fare to his office around $35, significantly more than the subway would have cost but acceptable given the circumstances. He was about to confirm the ride request when his phone buzzed with a news notification: multiple injuries in subway collision on Green Line. Emergency services responding. Green Line. Jacob's line. His usual route. He clicked the notification, read the brief article that was still being updated with incoming information. Train collision at approximately 8:30 a.m., cause under investigation, several passengers injured and transported to hospitals, service suspended indefinitely while authorities assess the situation and clear the scene. The article included preliminary maps showing the collision location, approximately 2 stops past where Jacob typically boarded, where the train would have been at around 8:28 a.m. if it had departed on its regular 8:24 a.m. schedule. The 8:24 a.m. train. Jacob's train. The train he would have been on if the coffee hadn't spilled, if he'd maintained his normal routine, if the 10-minute delay caused by cleaning up the mess hadn't meant missing that departure. The realization didn't arrive as sudden dramatic insight. Arrived gradually, as Jacob's mind slowly processed the temporal relationships, his usual arrival at platform at 8:21 a.m., his usual boarding of 8:24 a.m. train, the collision occurring at approximately 8:30 a.m. 2 stops after his boarding location. If he'd been on schedule, if his morning had proceeded normally, if the coffee hadn't spilled, he would have been on that train. Would have been somewhere in those cars when the collision occurred. Would have been among the passengers who were now being treated by emergency services, who were experiencing whatever injuries the collision had created. He stood in the cafe holding his phone, his ruined presentation materials in damp stack on the counter beside him, his clothing still wet with coffee, the replacement coffee Tyler had given him cooling in his other hand. People around him were conducting their normal morning activities, ordering coffee, checking phones, having conversations, moving through their days without awareness that anything significant was occurring. But Jacob felt suddenly detached from that normalcy, felt like he was observing the cafe from distance even though he was physically present in it. The physical sensations were strange. A chill despite the coffee warmth of his soaked clothing. His hands beginning to tremble slightly. His breath coming faster than normal. The particular quality of shock that accompanies recognition that something terrible has been narrowly avoided, that the gap between your actual situation and a much worse situation was measured in minutes, that minor annoyances you'd been cursing had actually been protective even though you'd experienced them as obstacles. He needed to sit down. Moved to the small table near the window that had been occupied earlier but that was now vacant, sat heavily in one of the chairs, set his phone on the table, stared at the news article still displayed on the screen. Read it again, more carefully this time, trying to absorb details about the collision that were still emerging as reporters gathered information from authorities and witnesses. No fatalities, that was emphasized, that was repeated in multiple places in the article, was apparently the most important fact authorities wanted to establish early. But several injuries, some potentially serious, passengers being transported to multiple hospitals, investigation ongoing about what had caused the collision. Jacob thought about the passengers on that train. Thought about the people who had been following their normal routines just as he'd been following his, who had boarded the 8:24 a.m. train expecting ordinary commute, who had been reading or listening to music or thinking about their upcoming workdays when the collision had occurred. Thought about how arbitrary the distribution of harm was. Some passengers might have been in cars that weren't severely impacted, might have experienced just disruption and delay and fear without physical injury, while others might have been in exactly wrong positions to absorb impact, might have experienced serious harm from what should have been routine transit use. And thought about the coffee spill. The minor disaster that had consumed his attention and frustration 10 minutes earlier, that had felt like final insult in morning already gone wrong, that had seemed like pure inconvenience requiring cleanup and apology and disruption to his established routine. That spill had delayed him by exactly the minutes necessary to miss the train that had been involved in collision. Had created gap between his presence and the collision's occurrence that meant he'd avoided whatever harm the collision had created for the passengers who'd been present. The causation was clear enough to be undeniable but also strange enough to feel almost unreal. If the man hadn't bumped his elbow. If the coffee cup had been positioned slightly differently on the narrow counter. If he'd been sitting at his usual table instead of standing at the cramped counter space. If the cafe had been less crowded. If Tyler hadn't been training and hadn't taken extra time with Jacob's order. Any of these variables being slightly different would have meant different timing, would have meant either avoiding the delay entirely or experiencing longer delay that would have meant missing multiple trains rather than just missing the specific train that had been involved in collision. Jacob remained at the cafe for another 20 minutes, unable to immediately transition to the next thing, unable to just move forward with his day as if nothing significant had occurred. He called his office, explained that he'd be delayed, that subway service had been suspended and that he'd need to reschedule the morning's client meeting. His supervisor was understanding, the subway collision was already appearing in news alerts, was legitimate excuse for tardiness, was affecting many commuters who relied on that line. The client meeting was rescheduled for early afternoon, giving Jacob time to address his ruined presentation materials and to compose himself before conducting the meeting. He eventually left the cafe, took rideshare to his apartment rather than to his office, changed out of his coffee-stained clothing, attempted to recreate his presentation materials from digital files stored on his laptop. The recreation was imperfect. He'd made handwritten notes on the physical materials that weren't captured in the digital versions, had developed familiarity with the physical documents through repeated review that he'd need to rebuild with the recreated versions. But the materials were adequate, would serve their purpose for the afternoon's meeting, would allow him to conduct the presentation competently even if not with the polish he'd have preferred. Throughout the morning, as he worked on recreating materials and preparing for the rescheduled meeting, his mind kept returning to the collision and to the temporal nearness of it, to the minutes that had separated his presence from the event. The news coverage continued developing throughout the day, more details about injuries, mostly minor, several passengers requiring hospital treatment but being released same day, 2 people admitted for observation but expected to recover fully, preliminary investigation findings, collision appeared to be result of signal malfunction combined with operator error, would require detailed analysis by transportation safety authorities, political responses, mayor expressing concern, transit authority promising comprehensive review. Jacob read these updates compulsively throughout the day, refreshing news sites to see new information, experiencing continued waves of disorientation and strange gratitude. No one had died. That fact was repeated in every article, was emphasized as most important outcome. Collision could have been much worse, quick emergency response had prevented fatalities, system had functioned adequately to prevent worst-case scenario. But people had been harmed, had experienced trauma even if their physical injuries were relatively minor, had had their normal Tuesday morning violently disrupted in ways that would probably affect them for extended period. And Jacob had been spared that experience by coffee spill. By minor disaster that he'd experienced as pure frustration when it was occurring, that he'd been angry about, that had seemed like meaningless bad luck requiring cleanup and apology. The contrast between how he'd experienced the spill and what the spill had actually accomplished was creating cognitive dissonance that he struggled to process. The same event was simultaneously minor annoyance and protective intervention, was both trivial and profound depending on perspective and knowledge about what it had prevented. The afternoon client meeting proceeded adequately. Jacob presented the recreated materials competently, fielded questions professionally, maintained the facade of calm expertise that was expected in his role. But internally he felt distant from the performance, felt like he was observing himself conducting the meeting rather than being fully present in it, felt like the morning's events had created gap between his professional identity and his internal experience that he couldn't quite bridge. After the meeting concluded, after the clients departed satisfied with the presentation, Jacob's supervisor asked if he was okay. "You seem a bit off today," she said, not critically but with genuine concern. "I know the subway situation created disruption, but is everything else all right?" Jacob considered how to respond. Considered explaining about the coffee spill, about the timing, about the narrow margin between his normal routine and presence on train that had crashed. But explaining felt impossible, would require articulating thoughts and feelings he hadn't fully processed himself, would require making sense of experience that felt beyond normal frameworks for understanding fortunate coincidence. "I'm fine," he said instead, offering professional reassurance that everything was under control. "Just a stressful morning. I'll be better tomorrow." But he wasn't sure that was true. Wasn't sure he'd be better tomorrow or that better was even appropriate response to what he'd experienced. Wasn't sure how to integrate the morning's events into normal understanding of how life worked, into his carefully maintained routine, into the framework he'd been using to manage his accumulated stress and difficulty. The following days and weeks revealed gradual behavioral changes that Jacob didn't consciously decide to implement but that emerged naturally from the collision's impact on his understanding. The rigid routine he'd been maintaining for 8 months began to relax, not dramatically, not in ways that created chaos or prevented him from meeting his obligations, but in ways that created more flexibility, more tolerance for deviation, more acceptance that unpredictability wasn't necessarily catastrophic. He still went to Greystone Cafe most mornings, still ordered the same coffee and bagel, still maintained general structure to his morning preparation and commute. But he stopped experiencing anxiety when minor variations occurred, stopped feeling that being 1 or 2 minutes off schedule was disaster requiring immediate correction, stopped treating his routine as rigid requirement rather than as general preference. When the cafe was crowded and his usual table was occupied, he sat somewhere else without frustration. When Tyler or unfamiliar barista was working instead of Carmen, he ordered without impatience about the slightly longer transaction time. The changes extended beyond his morning routine to other aspects of how he engaged with daily life. Small inconveniences that would previously have triggered disproportionate frustration, traffic delays, slow service at restaurants, coworkers running late for meetings, now registered as just normal variations in how events unfolded, as circumstances to be managed rather than as personal affronts requiring emotional response. He found himself extending patience and grace to others in ways he hadn't been capable of during the months when his own stress had made him reactive and irritable. He began thanking people more explicitly, the baristas who made his coffee, the subway operators who drove the trains, the administrative staff at his office who managed logistics he typically ignored, the countless service workers whose labor made his daily life function smoothly. Not effusively, not in ways that were awkward or excessive, just with genuine acknowledgement of their contributions, with recognition that the systems he relied on were maintained by people whose work deserved appreciation even when that work was functioning so smoothly it became invisible. He reconnected with some friends he'd been avoiding during the months of his isolation, not with dramatic explanations about why he'd been distant, just with simple messages suggesting coffee or dinner, with willingness to engage socially even when engaging required energy he didn't feel he had. The reconnections were sometimes awkward, required explaining where he'd been and why he'd been uncommunicative, required admitting that he'd been struggling in ways he'd previously been unwilling to acknowledge. But the awkwardness was bearable, was worth it for the restoration of connections he'd allowed to deteriorate. He started therapy, something he'd been considering for months but had been avoiding because seeking help felt like admitting defeat, because therapy seemed like luxury he couldn't afford even though his insurance covered it, because engaging with his difficulties directly felt more overwhelming than just maintaining the routine that was keeping him functional. But the collision had created urgency about addressing his underlying stress and isolation, had made clear that he'd been barely managing rather than actually being okay, had demonstrated that seemingly minor variations in circumstances could have major consequences and that building more resilient approaches to managing difficulty was necessary rather than optional. The therapy wasn't immediately transformative, wasn't magic solution that immediately resolved his stress or eliminated his loneliness. But it provided space to process what he'd been experiencing, provided external perspective on patterns he'd developed that weren't serving him well, provided tools for managing anxiety and building social connections and developing less rigid approaches to maintaining stability. The work was ongoing, would probably continue for extended period, but it was addressing underlying issues rather than just managing symptoms. His relationship to the collision itself evolved over time. Initially it had felt like miraculous escape, like divine intervention or cosmic luck that had protected him from harm through improbable sequence of minor events. But as weeks passed and as the emotional intensity of the immediate aftermath faded, it began to feel more ambiguous, was still significant, was still something he thought about frequently, but was also just one among countless near misses and fortunate coincidences that characterize any life, was perhaps not as unique or meaningful as it had initially seemed. People experienced near misses constantly without recognizing them, drove past accidents that occurred minutes after they'd passed the location, avoided buildings that collapsed hours after they'd left, missed flights that encountered serious problems. The temporal and causal chains that connect presence to harm or absence to safety are enormously complex, involve thousands of variables that interact in ways impossible to fully map. Jacob had happened to be aware of his near miss because the collision had been dramatic enough to generate news coverage and because the timing had been close enough that the connection was obvious. But probably he'd been near other harms that he'd avoided without awareness, had been protected by minor delays and changes in routine that hadn't been as visible as the coffee spill. This recognition didn't diminish the significance of what he'd experienced but contextualized it differently, made it feel less like unique cosmic intervention and more like becoming suddenly aware of the constant contingency that characterizes existence, the way outcomes depend on timing and position in ways that are mostly invisible until they become consequential. The coffee spill had mattered enormously, had quite literally prevented him from being on train that crashed, had protected him from potential harm. But it had mattered because of factors beyond the spill itself, because of the collision's timing and because of the particular sequence of events that had created the protective delay. 2 years after the collision, Jacob was still working at the architecture firm, still living in the city, still maintaining morning routine that included stopping at Greystone Cafe, though the routine was more flexible than it had been during his period of rigid scheduling. His stress levels had decreased substantially, partly through therapy, partly through making peace with his single status rather than treating it as failure requiring immediate correction, partly through rebuilding social connections that provided support and engagement beyond his work relationships. He occasionally thought about the collision and the coffee spill, particularly on November 14th anniversaries when news outlets would sometimes run retrospective stories about the incident and about the safety improvements that had been implemented in response to the investigation's findings. The memory had become integrated into his understanding of his own history, had become story he sometimes told to friends or dates when discussing formative experiences, had become reference point for thinking about fortune and contingency and the ways minor events can cascade into major consequences. But the memory wasn't defining, wasn't the central fact of his existence, wasn't something that consumed his daily thoughts, wasn't trauma that required ongoing management. Was just significant experience that had occurred, that had influenced how he thought about routine and control and gratitude, that had contributed to gradual positive changes in how he engaged with his life. The changes might have occurred anyway, the therapy might have happened eventually regardless of the collision, the social reconnections might have been motivated by other factors, the relaxation of rigid routine might have emerged through different catalysts. No way to know what would have happened in alternative timeline where the collision hadn't occurred or where he'd been on the train when it crashed. Carmen still worked the morning shift at Greystone Cafe most days. Tyler had moved on to different job, had been replaced by succession of other baristas who'd come and gone over the 2 years. Jacob had become regular enough that most of the staff knew his order, but he no longer depended on that familiarity, was comfortable ordering from whoever was working, was no longer treating the cafe as essential component of rigid routine but just as pleasant place to start his mornings when convenient. The subway system had implemented various safety improvements in response to the collision's investigation, updated signal systems, enhanced operator training, revised protocols for managing unusual situations. The improvements didn't eliminate all risk. Public transit systems are inherently complex and imperfect, involve thousands of daily operations that mostly function smoothly but that occasionally experience failures. But the improvements reduced risk, made similar collisions less likely, represented institutional learning from the incident that had affected Jacob's life so significantly. The passengers who'd been on the train had presumably moved forward with their lives, had presumably processed their experiences of the collision in various ways, had presumably integrated the trauma or disruption into their ongoing life narratives. Jacob didn't know any of them, had no connection to the people who'd experienced what he'd narrowly avoided, had no way to compare his response to their responses, had no framework for understanding whether his protective delay had been more fortunate than he'd recognized or whether the actual experience of the collision had been less traumatic than he'd imagined. But he thought about them sometimes, wondered whether they'd experienced lasting effects from the collision, whether the memory still affected their willingness to use public transit, whether they'd developed their own changed perspectives on routine and control and fortune. Wondered whether any of them had experienced the collision as transformative or whether most had just processed it as unfortunate disruption that had required recovery but that hadn't fundamentally altered their understanding of how to live. His own life continued, work projects and social activities and ongoing therapy and the gradual accumulation of experiences that constitute ordinary existence. No dramatic developments, no major transformations, just continued daily living with slightly more flexibility and slightly more gratitude than he'd had before the collision. The coffee spill remained part of his personal history, remained story he carried with him, remained reminder that minor annoyances sometimes serve purposes that aren't immediately visible, that interruptions aren't always obstacles, that the relationship between inconvenience and protection can be more complex than it appears in the moment. Sometimes the interruption isn't the problem, it's the protection. Sometimes the delay that frustrates you is saving you from harm you can't yet see. Sometimes the minor disaster that consumes your attention and creates stress is actually a barrier between you and much worse outcome that you'd have encountered without that temporary disruption. This isn't argument for fatalism or for passively accepting every inconvenience as secretly beneficial. Most delays are just delays, most disruptions are genuinely problematic, most minor disasters don't have hidden protective purposes. The coffee spill was protective only because of the specific timing of the collision, only because the delay it created happened to align with the narrow window that separated presence from harm. Different timing would have meant the spill was just a frustrating incident without larger significance. But the possibility exists, the possibility that what seems purely negative in the moment might have consequences that aren't purely negative, that the relationship between immediate experience and ultimate outcomes is more complex than linear causation suggests, that fortune and misfortune are categories that require knowing the full context to apply meaningfully. Jacob couldn't have known while cleaning coffee from his clothing that the delay was protective. Could only know that in retrospect, after the collision had occurred and after the temporal relationships became clear. So maintain some openness to ambiguity about whether disruptions are wholly negative. Not credulous belief that everything happens for a reason or that all difficulties serve hidden purposes. Those frameworks are often just ways of avoiding recognizing genuine harm or genuine injustice. But modest recognition that outcomes depend on contexts you can't fully perceive in the moment, that what seems like pure misfortune might have prevented worse outcomes, that patience with minor difficulties might be appropriate not just because patience is virtuous but because the full consequences haven't yet manifested. And perhaps extend more grace to the small disasters and delays that characterize daily life. The spilled coffee, the missed train, the minor setbacks that disrupt routines and create frustration, these deserve frustration, deserve acknowledgement as genuinely inconvenient, deserve attempts to address or prevent them. But they might also deserve recognition that they're operating within complex systems where consequences cascade in ways that aren't immediately visible, where the gap between minor inconvenience and major harm might be smaller than it appears, where protection sometimes arrives disguised as interruption. Jacob's experience was unusual in its clarity, the temporal relationships were close enough and the collision was dramatic enough that the protective nature of the delay was undeniable. Most people's near misses are invisible, are just variations in timing or position that prevent encounters with harms they never become aware of. But those invisible near misses are probably constant, are probably protecting all of us regularly from harms we avoid without recognition simply by being in slightly different places at slightly different times than the places and times where harm occurs. Live with some awareness of that constant contingency. Some recognition that fortune and misfortune are distributed through complex interactions you don't fully control and can't fully perceive. Some gratitude for the interruptions and delays that might be protective even when they seem purely frustrating. Some patience with the minor disasters that characterize ordinary life, knowing that their full significance won't be clear until much later, knowing that what seems catastrophic in the moment might be trivial in retrospect while what seems trivial might turn out to have prevented catastrophe. Sometimes the interruption isn't the problem. It's the protection. Be StoryWise.